He always said that the mountain had ways of speaking to those who arrived with enough quiet in their thoughts to truly listen. And whenever I remember the first time I saw him standing beside that small cabin that everyone in the valley used to mock, I realized that his presence there already carried the weight of a life shaped by patience rather than pride. It is strange how a man alone in the wilderness can make us question our own foundation even before he tells us a single word about his past, because something in the way he observed the wind sliding between the slopes made it clear that he had learned to be different. When he first arrived, the settlers in the valley laughed at the idea of building a home in a place where the ground was so rocky and the winters so severe that no tool seemed strong enough to break the frozen soil. They said he was wasting his life on a dream collapsed the first storm, and they mocked his decision to dig deeper than necessary for the foundation, calling it stupid, unnecessary, the work of a man who did not understand how things were done. They believed that a cabin was just a structure, something quick to raise before the first cold wind of autumn, and that the world rewarded speed rather than care. But he had a different view of the mountain, and as he planted each wooden beam into the earth, he shaped it with a certainty that whatever is meant to endure must begin from a place of stillness rather than urgency. I remember hearing him say that when someone chooses isolation willingly, people often mistake it for weakness or madness because they do not understand the courage it takes to face oneself without distraction. He explained that living up there was not a rejection of the world, but rather an acceptance, a rhythm that had always lived inside, waiting the right moment to surface. The settlers who laughed at him did so from a place of fear disguised as confidence, because deep down they sensed that his calmness challenged their noisy routine. They measured life through constant movement, through goals that followed one after the other, while he measured life by the sound of melting snow dripping from the eaves or the slow, deep breath of the mountain at dawn. And because they could not understand this, they tried to build a wall of mockery around him, hoping that their words would shake his determination. But he was already rooted deeper than any foundation they had ever built. During those early mornings when the fog climbed the slope like a living creature, he would stand on the threshold of his unfinished cabin with his hands wrapped around a cup of boiling water, watching the sky turn from indigo pale blue. He spoke little, but when he did, his words carried the weight of someone who had lived enough to know that life does not reward the loudest voice, but the one that listens longest. He told me once that building his home on that mountain was not about resisting the world below, but about embracing the world within, the one that needed silence to breathe. He said the mountain gave him exactly what he had been searching for, even if he did not know he. And as his cabin slowly rose from the cold ground, shaped by hands that worked not in haste, but in gratitude, he seemed to bloom in the solitude that others feared so deeply. People often imagine that those who choose a solitary life must be running from something, but with him it was the opposite. He was running toward something vast, quiet, something that only revealed itself to those who stayed still long enough to feel its presence. Whenever the settlers passed by on their way to gather timber or hunt along the lower trails, they would shake their heads at the sight of his unfinished home. They said no man should live so high up where the winds turned violent and the storms rolled in without warning. They said that no matter how deep he dug his foundation, the mountain would eventually swallow his efforts like it had swallowed so many before him. But the man simply listened and nodded, never arguing, never defending him, because he knew that those who mocked him were speaking to their own fears rather than to him. There was a humility in him that you rarely find in people who live close to the comfort of town. He carried every beam, the patience of someone who felt grateful chance to build something belonged entirely to him. He shaped the stones with a slow and steady rhythm, as if he were coaxing them into remembering their ancient purpose. And every evening, when the light faded behind the ridge and the valley turned golden, he would sit outside the emerging cabin and study the land as though it were telling stories who had lived and died there long before his arrival. He once said that the silence of the mountain is not an emptiness, but a fullness too vast for most hearts to hold, and that if a man learns to surrender to it rather than fill it with noise, he discovers a form of peace that is impossible to describe. As the first autumn approached, the settlers continued to ridicule him, especially when they saw how much effort he was putting into the foundation. They called it excessive and foolish, saying that a cabin was a simple thing, and that he was turning it into a monument to his own stubbornness. But he knew something they did not know, something the mountain had whispered to him during those long mornings alone, the shifting fog. He knew that the storms coming that year would be stronger than usual, that the ground would tremble beneath the weight of icy winds, and that only a home anchored deeply would withstand the assault. It was not a superstition or a guess, but a feeling that grew inside him every time he listened to the mountain's breath, and so he kept digging deeper, carving into the earth with a sense of purpose that no mockery could diminish. What struck me most about him was the quiet joy he carried in every movement. He did not seem burdened by the work, nor did he ever complain about the cold or the physical strain. Instead, he worked with a gentle determination, like a man whose hands knew they were shaping not just a structure, but a life. He was not building a cabin to hide from the world. He was building a place where he could meet the world on his own terms, a place where solitude was not loneliness, but communion with everything that truly mattered, a place where he could finally breathe without the weight of expectation. When winter finally arrived, the first storms came roaring across the ridge like beasts released from their cages. The settlers hurried into their poorly anchored homes, hoping the walls would hold against the violent gusts of wind. But as the snow piled up, the frozen earth shifted beneath them. One cabin after another began to shake, creak, and collapse under the pressure. People shouted, scrambled for shelter, and sought safety in places that had never been meant to endure such force. Yet, high on the mountain, the solitary cabin stood firm, unmoved, as if rooted to the very soul of the earth. The deep foundation that everyone had mocked was now the only reason his home remained standing while the valley suffered through destruction and fear. When the storm finally passed, settlers climbed the mountain to check on him. They found him sitting outside his cabin, calm smile, surrounded by untouched snow. There was no pride in his expression, no sense of victory over those who had doubted him. There was only quiet gratitude for the shelter the mountain had offered and for the wisdom that had guided his hand. He welcomed them as though nothing remarkable had happened, offering warmth, shelter, and food to those who had once laughed at him. His story reminds us sometimes the things we build slowly and quietly become the very things that save us in the world. It shows that wisdom often appears foolish to those who rush through life without listening to the deeper truths beneath their feet. And in moments like these, I like to think that each of us carries a mountain within us, waiting patiently to be heard, waiting for the day we decide to build our foundation deep enough to withstand whatever storms may come. He was not born among mountains, though many who later heard his story assumed so, believing that such serenity could only belong to a man raised among silence and wind. In truth, he came from a small town far below the ridges, a place where the noise of life seemed to rest. There were always carts moving through the dusty streets, hammers striking metal in the forges, children shouting near the wells, and voices echoing from the tavern long after night had fallen. It was a place where time passed quickly and restlessly, where every man tried to prove his worth through busyness, and where silence was often mistaken for laziness or sorrow. For years, He lived among them, working with the same urgency, believing that to stop for a moment was to fall behind. He built, traded, spoke, and laughed like the rest. But deep inside him, there was a growing space, a hollow, no sound. The more he tried to be part of that rhythm, the more he felt its dissonance vibrating against his own. He had been a builder even then, skilled with his hands and respected for his craft. People came to him to raise homes, barns, and fences because his work was strong and his lines always. Yet what they valued in him was not what he valued in himself. They admired the speed of his labor, while he cherished the moments when he could simply stand back and watch the sun's reflection move across the surface. They wanted him to hurry from one project to another, but he longed to linger, to listen, structure, breathe, to understand what the materials wished to become. Over time, this quiet desire made him seem strange to those around, as if his calm attention The world of men, after all, does not easily forgive those who move slower than the crowd. And so the jokes began, harmless at first, but sharp enough to leave small wounds. They called him dreamer, drifter, and later simply fool. Yet he never argued back, for in his heart he knew that noise always wins in the short run, but never in the end. There was a woman in his life then, someone who loved his quiet nature at first because it made her feel safe, as though his stillness could protect her from the restlessness of the world. But over the years, that same stillness began to weigh on her, and she started to see it not as strength, but at distance. She wanted him to speak more, to plan more, to chase more. She dreamed of a bigger home in the center of town, of guests and celebration, of a life that others would admire. He, on the other hand, dreamed of space and air, of mornings where only the wind greeted him. Their love did not end with anger or betrayal. It simply faded quietly, like smoke that drifts too far from its fire. When she finally left, she told him she could no longer live with someone who seemed to belong somewhere else. And she was right, though neither of them knew where that somewhere else would be. After she left, he continued to build, but each hammer strike echoed differently. The town, which had once felt small but familiar, began to close around him like a cage. Every sound, every face, every conversation carried the weight of something lost. He began to walk farther each evening, following the river that flowed north toward the mountains. He said that the sound of water on stone, the first true silence he ever heard, because it filled the air without demanding attention. It moved with purpose, yet without hurry. He would walk for hours, watching how it carved its way through the land, and in those walks he began to understand that everything moved slowly. Water, wind, and time. They were the true builders of the world, and none of them rushed. It was during one of those walks that he first saw the mountains, not as distant shapes, but as living presence. He described it later, calling not a voice, not a vision, deep recognition. The peaks rose like ancient guardians, both welcoming and indifferent, and he felt something inside him stir with a certainty he had never known. He realized then that he could no longer remain among people who measured worth by how loudly they spoke or how quickly. He needed to find a place where time moved pace his own. So he began to prepare. He sold most of what he owned, keeping only his tools, a few essential. The townspeople laughed again, saying he was losing his mind, that grief had broken him, but he only smiled. It was not grief that guided him anymore. It was clarity. The journey to the mountain took him weeks, the paths steep, the air thin, and the nights colder than anything he had known. Yet, with every step he felt lighter, as if each mile removed another layer of noise from his spirit. When he finally reached the plateau where he would build his cabin, he stood for a long time, letting the wind push against him. He said the mountain spoke then, not in words, but in a pulse, a rhythm that matched his heartbeat. And in that moment, he knew he was home. The land was rough, the soil hard, but it was honest. It asked for patience, and patience the only thing he had in abundance. He began to dig the foundation, not as a builder seeking to finish a job, but as a man trying to understand the language of stone and earth. Every strike of his shovel revealed layers of time, roots, and rock that told their own story. He felt that by digging, he was not only creating space for his home, but also clearing away the noise that had filled his life. Each handful of earth lifted from the ground seemed to make him more himself. He worked without rush, guided by instinct rather than plan, trusting that the mountain would reveal what it needed from him. And so, when others later called his foundation foolishly deep, they could not see that what he was truly building was not a structure but a way of being. The first season on the mountain was the hardest. Food was scarce, and the tools dulled quickly against the stone. The nights were long and lonely, and the silence sometimes pressed against him with such intensity that he could feel it vibrating in his bones. But even in those moments, he never doubted his choice. He said that loneliness is not the absence of others, but the absence of standing. And in that silence, he began to understand himself. The mountain did not comfort him. It challenged him, stripped him bare of pretense, and demanded honesty. It was not a gentle teacher, but it was a true one. Sometimes he would look back toward the valley and see the faint smoke rising from the settlers' homes. He imagined them laughing, living, busy with their endless tasks. He did not resent them, but he no longer envied them either. He knew now that most people live surrounded by things that do not matter because they are afraid to face the emptiness that lies. But he had chosen to face that emptiness directly, to build his foundation upon it, and in doing so, he discovered that emptiness is not void, possibility. It is the space where meaning can grow. When the settlers finally came up to see what he was doing, they found him thinner, tanned by the sun and calm. They mocked his, saying that he had spent too much time underground, that his cabin would never rise before the sun. He only smiled and kept working. Later, when the storms destroyed their own homes and his cabin stood unshaken, they would remember that smile. But at that time, they could only see stubbornness, not wisdom. It is always easy to laugh at what you do not yet understand. As he built, he began to notice changes within himself that he could not explain. His thoughts slowed, his heartbeat synchronized with the rhythm of his work, and his dreams became clearer. He started to see patterns in everything, the way frost formed on the grass, the direction of bird flight, the shifting of shadows at noon. Life revealed itself not as a sequence of events, but as a conversation, continuous and patient. The mountain was speaking, and he was finally fluent enough to listen. He said that once you learn that language, you never return to the world the same way. And so, when people ask why he left the town, why he chose solitude, I tell them it was not escape, but return. He did not go to the mountain to hide from life, but to live it without interference. He wanted to remember what it meant to exist without constant comparison, to feel the passage of time not through clocks or wages, but through the changing. His foundation was not only under his cabin, but under his soul. It was a choice to dig deep enough to touch something eternal. He never regretted leaving, not once. Even during the harshest winters, when the snow buried the trails and the nights stretched endlessly, he felt alive in a way that the town could never offer. The silence became his companion, the cold his teacher, and the mountain his witness. And when he spoke of those days later, there was always a warmth in his voice, as though he had finally met himself years. If you are listening to this and have ever felt the same quiet pull toward solitude, know that it is not madness. It is memory. It is your soul reminding you that there is more to life than noise and motion. Tell me, if you can, Whether you have ever felt that same call of silence, that longing for stillness that no city can satisfy. And if you have, stay with me, because this story is not only about a man and his mountain, it is about all of us who have ever dreamed of building something unshakable within ourselves. When the silence of the mountain finally became his only companion, he discovered that there is a rhythm beneath stillness, a kind of breathing that the land performs without effort, and it began to guide every movement he made. Days were no longer marked by clocks or calendars, but by the shifting color of the sky, by the way the sun leaned differently upon the rocks, by the whisper of wind that changed its tone as the seasons turned. He no longer asked what day it was, because the mountain did not keep track of days. It only knew cycles, and within those cycles he found something truer than time itself. In the beginning it was strange to wake with sound, to open his eyes to nothing quiet of snow or the thin hum of a stream. Yet soon he began to realize that the world had never been. It was only that he had been too loud to hear it. His morning started before dawn, still a deep blue. The stars hung motionless above the ridge. He would light the small fire he had built from the driest pieces of wood, moving slowly so that the crackle of the flames would not break the sacred calm of that hour. The steam rising from the pot on the fire felt like a living thing, twisting gently as the heat touched the cold air. He would drink in silence, watching the first line of light stretch across the snow, and each morning it felt like a promise renewed. There was no need for words. The mountains spoke in gesture and tiny details, the way frost formed on his window, the creak of the trees under weight of ice, the faint echo of a distant avalanche. Everything meant something if you listened long enough. As weeks passed, he learned to move in harmony with this rhythm. He gathered wood. The sky told him it was time, not when his mind told him it should be done. He fished in the stream only when it flowed, knowing that too much haste would disturb the quiet balance between hunger and patience. He built his traps for small game with care, never taking more than he needed, never killing out of habit. He said that, in solitude, every act becomes a mirror. The way you cut wood, the way you eat, the way you breathe, all of it reflects the person you truly are when no one is watching. In that sense, the mountain did not isolate him. It revealed him. There were moments when the solitude felt heavy, of course, when the nights grew so long that even the fire seemed distant. He would sit by the window, listening to the wind scratching against the wood. He sometimes heard voices, not ghosts, memories, the laughter from the town, the warmth of another presence beside him, the old rhythm of life he had left. But those moments of longing did not bring regret. They were reminders of how far he had come, of how small the world of noise had been compared to the vastness he had found here. He said that missing the past is natural, but clinging to it is a form of blindness. Out here, he had no choice, because the mountain would not allow anyone to look backward for too long. He began keeping a journal, though not every day. The pages were filled not with dates or events, but with observation. How the snow melted differently depending on where the light touched it, how the ravens circled above the cliffs only at certain times, how the air smelled different before a storm. He wrote not to remember, but to understand. In one entry, he described how a single drop of melting snow slid down his cabin wall, tracing a slow, deliberate path through the dust, and how watching it made him realize that life moves in small, unstoppable motion. He wrote, "Everything that endures begins quietly." Those words, found years later, would become the most accurate description of him anyone could ever give. When spring came, it arrived not as a sudden change, but as a slow awakening. The snow softened first near the base of the tree, where the sun lingered longest, and the sound of dripping water returned like distant music. Birds came back one by one, shy at first, as if testing whether the silence would accept them again. He welcomed their songs as he would a conversation with old friends. He planted small patches of soil near his cabin, Though he knew the mountain would never offer, still he believed that effort, a form of gratitude. To care for even a small piece of land was to thank it for the shelter it provided. He grew herbs, roots, and a few hardy vegetables, but his true sustenance came from the peace that surrounded him. He said that hunger of the body is easy to satisfy, but hunger of the soul requires a different kind of nourishment. Over time, animals began to appear near his home more frequent. A fox would linger by the edge of the clearing, curious but calm. Birds nested in the beams of his cabin, unafraid of his presence. Even the deer began to pass close, pausing to look at him with calm, steady eyes. It was as if the mountain itself had accepted him as part of its own creation. He never tried to tame or feed them. He simply shared space. In silence, he understood that coexistence is not control, but respect. The animals sensed that he was no longer a stranger here, that his intentions had softened into belonging. There is a kind of trust that can only be earned through stillness, and he had finally learned its language. At night, he would sometimes lie on the ground outside, looking up at the stars. The sky seemed endless, and in that immensity, he often felt himself disappear, not in fear, but in peace. To vanish into something greater was, for him, the purest form of existence. He no longer carried the anxiety of defining himself, because the mountain had shown him that identity is not something to hold tightly, but something to release. The self, he said, is like snow. When you stop trying to shape it, it falls perfectly. It was during one of those nights under the vast moonlit silence that he realized he had not spoken aloud for several days. The thought did not frighten him. Instead, it filled him with quiet wonder. Words had once been his way of proving he existed, but now he understood that existence required no proof. The mountain knew him, the air knew him, the ground beneath his cabin knew him, and in that knowing there was no need for sound. Sometimes he would imagine the people in the valley living as he once did, rushing, worrying, chasing after things that would never bring peace. He did not judge them, but he pitied the noise they lived inside. He wished they could stand here just once and feel what he felt, the heartbeat of the earth beneath the snow, the eternal patient stone. He said that if people could hear silence the way he heard it, they would understand that most of what they call problems are only echoes of their own restlessness. But he also knew that silence cannot be taught. It must. Years passed like seasons turning through a single breath. His hair grew white, his hands rough and scarred, yet his eyes remained clear. The cabin aged with him, its wood darkening, its foundation holding firm. He often said that the foundation was his greatest teacher. It reminded him that what lies unseen is what holds everything together. People look at what stands above the ground and forget the effort buried beneath. But in life, as in building, the unseen work determines the strength at last. That was the truth he had lived for. Once a traveler found his way up the trail, lost and exhausted from a failed hunting trip. The man knocked weakly on the cabin door, half expecting no answer. But the builder opened it, offered warmth, food, and a place by the fire. The traveler stared around, astonished by how serene everything felt. "How did you manage to live up here alone?" he asked. The old man smiled and said, "I'm not alone. You're just not quiet enough to see what keeps me company." The traveler laughed awkwardly, thinking it was a joke, but as the night deepened, he began to sense the truth of it. There was a presence in the silence, not haunting, but alive. And when he left the next morning, something in him changed. He said later that it was the first time he had ever felt still. Through those long years, the man on the mountain learned that silence was not absent, abundant. Every whisper of wind carried meaning. Every shift of soil revealed He no longer measured his days in achievements or failures, but in awareness. When he built his fire, he thanked the fallen trees. When he drank from the stream, He felt the memory of the glacier that had carved it. When he breathed, he understood that even air has a. To him, nothing was ordinary. Everything was alive, everything sacred. And so, when people later told the story of his cabin that withstood every storm, they often forgot that its strength did not come from stone or wood, but from the quiet that built it. Silence, patience, and trust. Those were his true material. The foundation was not only deep in the earth, it was deep in his heart. And because of that, no wind could ever. If you are still here listening, tell me, have you ever heard silence speak? It does not use words, but it knows. And if you stay still long enough, it might tell you who you really are. The year that tested everything began quietly, as all great changes do. There was no warning, no sudden shift in the wind to signal that the mountain was about to awaken with a force unlike anything he had known before. The days passed gently at first, the air crisp, and the trees shedding their last golden leaves in silence. He had grown used to reading the signs of the seasons, to sensing the moods of the land, and he felt no reason to doubt the balance that had kept him company for so long. Yet, beneath that stillness, deep inside the stone heart of the mountain, something was stirring. It was the kind of movement that the earth, until the exact moment it's to reveal its. He had been repairing part of the cabin wall that day, replacing a beam that had weathered one too many winters. His hands worked calmly, his thoughts simple and clear, when he noticed a sound unlike the usual whisper of the wind. It was low and distant at first, like a murmur beneath the soil. The birds had gone silent. Even the air seemed to pause. Then came the deep rumble, rolling slowly through the valley, followed by another, heavier and closer. He set his tools down and stepped outside, scanning the horizon. The sky looked normal, the clouds pale and thin, but the ground beneath his boots trembled softly. It was not yet violent, just enough to remind him that nothing in this world ever stays truly still. When the first tremor passed, he waited. He had felt small quakes before, moments when the mountain shifted its weight like a sleeping animal. But that day, there was something different in the air, an unease he could not explain. The animals felt it too. The fox that usually lingered near the trees was nowhere to be seen, and the ravens flew in strange, erratic circles above the ridge. The man sat outside his cabin, his eyes tracing the distant snow line, and he whispered a quiet thought that perhaps even the mountain must sometimes break to remember its own strength. By nightfall, the wind began to roar. It came howling through the trees with a voice that seemed both ancient and new, carrying with it the sharp scent of snow and stone. The sky darkened faster than usual, and the air grew heavy with strange stillness that made the world smaller. He reinforced the door, checked the shutters, and stacked wood beside the fire, his movements deliberate but unhurried. He had lived long enough on this land to know that panic serves no one. When nature speaks, you listen. When it tests, you bow. The storm arrived after midnight. Snow and wind roared together like this, sweeping across the slopes with relentless force. The cabin groaned under the weight of the gust. The windows rattled, and the fire flickered with each surge of air that found its way through the smallest crack. He sat by the hearth, wrapped in a wool blanket, listening to the voice outside the world into. There was no valley, no sky, no shape, only sound, pure and unending. Hours passed like this, though he could not tell how many. At times, he felt the mountain tremble beneath him, the deep growl of shifting rock echoing through the floor. It was then that he understood why the foundation mattered more than anything else he had built. He could feel it, strong, unmoving, alive. The earth beneath his cabin held firm, absorbing the violence above, carrying the weight of the storm without surrender. And as he sat there, calm in the middle of chaos, he realized that this was the moment the mountain had prepared him for. Every quiet morning, every slow movement, every act of patience had been a lesson leading to this single truth, that what is deeply rooted cannot be broken. The storm lasted 3 days. When it finally cleared, the landscape had changed. Trees lay snapped like twigs. The paths vanished under meters of snow, and the air hung thick with the smell of damp earth. The settlers below had never known such destruction. Their homes, built quickly, raised shallow, proud but unanchored, had fallen one by one under the weight of wind and snow. Those who survived the first night gathered what they could and climbed toward the mountain, believing that higher ground would save them. It was then, for the first time in years, that they saw smoke rising gently as chimney. They came in small groups, tired and frightened, their clothes torn, their faces pale with cold. When they reached his cabin, they stood for a moment in disbelief. It was still standing, untouched, surrounded by snow that had melted slightly around its base, as though the mountain itself protected it. The deep foundation, once mocked as foolish, had become the difference between ruin and refuge. He opened the door without hesitation and welcomed them inside. His voice was steady, his eyes kind. There was no pride in his manner, no trace of vengeance toward those who had once called him mad. He simply offered warmth, food, and shelter. For days they stayed, packed closely in the small cabin, sharing silence more than words. The storm had humbled them, stripped away the certainty that their way of life, the only right. They watched how the man moved slowly, efficiently, without waste. He spoke rarely, but when he did, his words carried a quiet wisdom that settled into the heart like embers. The mountain gives and takes, he told them one evening as the fire burned low. It asks only that you learn to stand still when it moves. No one answered him, but they all felt the truth of it. When the weather finally calmed enough for them to return to the valley, they left his cabin with gratitude, promising to rebuild with more care, to listen more closely to the land. Whether they truly did, he would never know, but he hoped so. Before they departed, one of the younger men turned back and said, "We used to call your foundation foolish." The old man smiled faintly and replied, "That's all right. Wisdom often looks foolish when you're standing on shallow ground." The young man bowed his head, and the rest followed him down, their footsteps fading into the soft snow. In the days that followed, the man repaired small damages around the cabin, though nothing severe. The storm had left him untouched, but it had also left him changed. For the first time, he felt the true power of what he had built. Not just in wood and stone, spirit. He understood now that endurance is not strength alone. It is surrender. The mountain does not resist the wind. It allows it to pass. The trees that survive are those that bend. And the man who remains standing after the storm is not the one who fought hardest, the one who listened best. That spring, when the snow finally melted, the valley looked different. The settlers rebuilt their homes slowly, some using heavier stone, some digging deeper foundations. Occasionally, they would climb to visit him, bringing gifts, salt, bread, or tools as a quiet sign of respect. They no longer laughed at his solitude or his strange habit. They had seen what he saw now, that the world rewards patience more than speed and depth more than height. Among those visitors was a young boy who had survived the storm with his family. He often came alone, sitting near the cabin while the man worked. The boy asked endless questions about building the mountain silent. The old man answered simply, letting the boy find the truth between his words. He taught him how to choose wood, how to listen for hollowness in a beam, how to feel the weight of the earth beneath his feet. But more than that, he taught him how to wait. "Every sound has a meaning," he told the boy one morning. "If you rush, you'll only hear noise. But if you wait, you'll understand what the world is saying." The boy nodded, though he didn't yet understand. Understanding comes later, after you've forgotten the question. Through the years, the boy grew stronger, wiser, more like the man who had taught. And in time, the man saw in the boy's eyes the same quiet certainty that had brought him to the mountain long ago. He knew then that the mountain's lessons would not be lost. They would live on in another pair of hands, in another heart, willing to listen. When the settlers told the story of that storm, they always spoke of the man's cabin that never fell. But those who had been there knew that the true miracle was not the cabin itself, but the man within it, the way he carried peace through destruction, the way he offered kindness without pride. They said that if you stood near his home at dusk, you could hear the sound of wind passing through the beams like a voice whispering gratitude. And perhaps that was true. If you are still here, listening to this story, let it remind you that what is built with care never truly falls. That storms will come, and they will shake everything that stands shallow, but what is rooted in patience and humility endures. That is the truth of every mountain and every soul. And if you have not yet found your foundation, maybe it is time to start digging. If this part resonated with you, stay with the story and make sure you are here when the next chapter rises from the silence. You can follow this journey because there is still more to uncover about what the man learned from the world above the cloud. As the years continued their quiet passage, he found that the storm had not only reshaped the valley, but had also transformed his understanding of the world and of himself. He had long believed that the mountain's teacher, but after that winter, he began to realize that it was also his mirror. Everything he saw in its ridges, its silence, its endurance, was a reflection of what existed within him. The patience he had cultivated was not merely a survival skill, it was a way of seeing. The strength of his foundation was not only the reason his cabin stood, but also the proof the human spirit, deeply anchored in truth, could remain upright even when the earth beneath it trembled. The mountain no longer felt like a place he lived upon. It felt like a living being he was a part of. He spent more time walking along its slopes, not searching for anything in particular, but letting his feet follow the trails the wind had written into the grass. The land spoke through patterns that only years of stillness could reveal. The way moss grew on the northern faces of rocks, the faint trace of animal, the shifting tone of the air before rain, all of it was language. The older he grew, the more fluent he became. He often said that the mountain had taught him to listen not with his ears, but with his bones, because true understanding comes from within the body, not from the noise that surrounds it. When he reached the highest ridge, he could see the valley stretched far below, a patch of green and brown field, surrounded faint ribbons. From that height, the world looked slower, almost forgiving. He sometimes wondered what it would feel like to return there, even for a day, to walk among people, to hear their laughter, their worries. But every time that thought arose, faded just as quickly. The valley was no longer home. Its rhythm belonged to another kind of life, one he had already outgrown. He bore no bitterness toward it, only gratitude, because without the noise of that world, he would never have heard the silence of the people below had not forgotten him. They spoke of him now with a kind of reverence, calling him the man of the mountain, the keeper of silence, the builder whose foundation never broke. Sometimes travelers came to visit, drawn by curiosity more than faith. They wanted to see the cabin, defied the storm, to meet the man who had lived alone for so many years. Some came seeking wisdom, others simply seeking a story to carry back down the. He received them all with the same quiet grace, offering them tea, warmth, stillness. Few knew what to say in the presence of someone so calm. Words felt unnecessary, almost fragile in the thick air of his silence. He never considered himself a teacher, yet those who visited left changed. They said there was something about his way of being that softened the noise. One traveler, a young woman who had lost everything to a flood in a nearby village, asked him once if loneliness ever became unbearable. He looked at her for a long moment and said, "Loneliness is not the absence of others, it is the absence of understanding. Once you understand the world, you are never alone." She wept when she heard that, though he did not comfort her with words. Instead, he poured her another cup of, and together they sat watching the clouds drift slowly between the peaks. Over time, he noticed that people came not to hear him speak, but simply to share the silence it found. They would stay for an hour, a night, sometimes longer, then descend again with something in their eyes that was softer than when they arrived. He once wrote in his journal, "I think silence is contagious. When a man becomes quiet enough, the world around him begins to listen too." That simple line would later be carved into the wooden beam above his door by one of the settlers who came to honor him after his passing. But while he lived, it was just a thought written in fading ink on a yellowed page. Each season brought new lessons. In spring, he learned renewal. In summer, gratitude. In autumn, release. And in winter, endurance. The mountain, a complete education, each element a different teacher. Even the storms which others feared had become old companions. He said they were reminders that peace without challenge is not peace at all. It is stagnation. True peace comes from knowing you can bend without breaking, that you can lose everything and still remain your. He had few possessions left. The years had reduced his needs to almost a pot, a knife, a few blankets. His tools and his journal were all he required. The rest was given to him freely by the mountain, the air, the water, the wood, the life. He often said that the more you own, the less space you have to live. Simplicity to him was not a discipline, a form of respect. When you take little, the world gives much. When you demand much, the world withdraws its kindness. He saw this truth in the way the land healed itself each spring, in how even the smallest blade of grass knew how to rise again after being buried by snow. It was during one of those long summers that a great fire broke out in the lower valley. It began with lightning struck dry timber, spreading quickly through the fields and homes. Smoke rose thick and black into the sky, and from his vantage point he could see it curling like a serpent across the horizon. Days later, the survivors came climbing again, some wounded, some empty-handed, their eyes hollow from loss. They sought refuge once more near his cabin, not because it was large enough to hold them all, but because they remembered the strength of its foundation. And again, he welcomed a question. He shared what little he had, helped them build temporary shelters nearby, and guided them to the streams that never ran dry, even in drought. As they worked, one of the younger men asked him how he had known to build his home so deep, so strong. The old man paused before answering, his eyes fixed on the horizon where smoke still drifted faintly. "I didn't build it to resist," he said. "I built it to belong. There is a difference. What resists eventually cracks. What belongs endures." The words hung in the air long after he spoke them. The young man would later repeat them to his children, and they to theirs, until it became a saying passed through generations. What belongs endures. During those days of rebuilding, he saw once more the pattern that had repeated itself through his life, the cycle of destruction and renewal, of loss, followed by rebirth. It reminded him of the season, of the way the snow must melt for the flowers to bloom. He began to believe that the mountain's greatest lesson was not about solitude, but about impermanence. Everything changes, and the only thing a man can truly build is his understanding of that truth. When you accept that nothing lasts, you begin to live fully because you no longer fear the end. In quiet moments, he would sit outside at dusk, the fire burning low, the valley glowing faintly beneath the fading sun. He thought about the woman he once loved, the town he had left, the laughter he had known. None of it hurt any more. Memory had become a kind of. He said that time does not heal wounds. It teaches you how to live with them until they become part of your strength. And as he gazed across the horizon, he felt gratitude for every choice, every storm, every silence that led him here. The settlers rebuilt once more, and this time their homes stood longer, wiser, truer. They no longer mocked the deep foundation. They honored it. The boy he had once taught returned as a grown man, carrying his own son on his shoulders. He visited the old man often, helping with repairs, bringing stories from the valley. They shared long evenings together, talking less, listening more. The boy, now a man, had built his home deeper than any other in the valley, and during every storm it was the first to remain standing. He often said it was not his strength, but his teacher's voice held it up. And so, the man on the mountain realized that his life, though lived in solitude, had reached farther than he had ever imagined. His silence had become a message, carried not through words, but through example. People in the valley began to speak differently about patience, about listening, about the strength that comes in depth. The world below had changed quietly because one man had chosen to live deeply instead of loudly. He wrote in his journal, one final reflection that year: the mountain is not a place. It is a way of being. To live like the mountain is to stand still while the world rushes, to hold firm when the winds howl, to trust that even the storms come to. If you are listening, know that this story is not about distant isolation. It is about finding your foundation in a world that keeps shaking. It is about learning to belong rather than resist. And if it speaks to something inside you, then perhaps you have already begun to hear your own mountain calling. If the quiet of this part reached you, take a moment to breathe, to listen, and to stay with the story. There is one last stretch to walk together, where silence meets legacy. Stay with me. Subscribe to this journey, because what comes next is not just an ending, it is a return. The years, like the seasons, folded quietly upon themselves until time no longer moved in the way he once understood it. The days became less a sequence and more a single, unbroken rhythm of light and shadow, silent and sound, life and rest. His hair had turned white like the snow that covered the peaks, and his hands, though slower, still carried the calm strength that had shaped the earth decades before. The mountain had accepted him completely. He was part of its memory, part of its breath. Even the wind seemed to know his name, circling gently around the cabin before disappearing down the valley. There was no longer a difference between the man and the land. They had grown into one another, roots into stone. He woke each morning before sunrise, not because he had to, but because that hour between darkness and light had become sacred to him. The silence at that time was unlike any other silence, thicker, almost alive. He would sit by the doorway of his cabin, wrapped his blanket, watching the first light brushed the peak with gold. Each morning he greeted the mountain not with words, but with presence. His body was slower, his movements careful, yet there was still a precision in everything he did. He boiled water for tea, he cleaned his tools, he swept the floor, though no one but he would ever see it. There was dignity in care, he believed, even in solitude. He said once, the act of keeping things in order was a form of gratitude to life itself. The valley below had changed over the years. The children of those who once mocked him had grown old themselves, and their homes stood stronger now, deeper in the earth, shaped by the wisdom he had unknowingly passed on. Sometimes smoke from their chimneys drifted upward in the distance, and he felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that something of his silence had taken root. They still spoke of him, though few had seen him in many years. Some said he was a spirit who guarded the ridge, others said he was immortal, bound to the mountain by some old pact. He smiled when he heard such stories from travelers, for he knew that every myth begins as a memory of truth. In his solitude, he no longer felt alone. The foxes still came near his cabin in the evenings, sometimes resting beside the stones as if to share the warmth that lingered from his fire. The ravens, wiser now, called out from the trees a sound that felt more like greeting than warning. The mountain silence had become a language he could speak fluently, and he understood each sound, each motion, each small change in the air. When the wind shifted, He knew which season was coming. When the sky glowed in strange colors, he knew the snow would be late or early. His awareness had grown so deep that he often sensed what was about to happen before it did. But he no longer saw that as knowledge. It was simply belonging. He had begun to feel his strength fade gradually, not with pain, but with peace. His breath grew shorter on steep climbs. His hands trembled when he worked too long. Yet none of it troubled him. He said that aging is not the body's way of dying. It is its way of remembering what it was always meant to become. He had no fear of death, only curiosity. He had watched countless things end on the mountain, storms, seasons, and each time something new had emerged. He believed that death was not an ending, but a transformation, a returning to the same stillness which everything is born. One autumn afternoon, as the last leaves drifted down in silence, he began to. His final entry in the journal followed him through all. The pages were brittle, the ink faded, but his words came clear. He wrote that the world below would never stop moving, never stop searching for meaning in places where meaning cannot be bought or built. He wrote that the only truth worth keeping is the one that comes when everything else has fallen away. In the end, he wrote, the mountain teaches that all noise fades, all walls crumble, and only silence, and silence, you listen closely, is not empty. It is full of everything. That night, he lit a single candle and sat by the fire for a long time, watching the shadows dance across the wall. The air outside was still. The moon rose high and bright, and its light entered through the window, touching his hands like a farewell. He closed his eyes and listened one more to the heartbeat of the mountain, that low, eternal rhythm that had guided him this day he arrived. He did not know if he fell asleep or simply drifted into the silence it always by morning, the fire had burned down, the candle had melted away, and the old man was still sitting upright in his chair, a faint smile on his lips. When the first visitors from the valley came weeks later, they found him at peaceful mountain. The foxes lingered nearby, unafraid, and the cabin stood strong as ever, untouched at time. They buried him behind his home, at the edge of the clearing where the morning sun touched first. They marked the spot with a single stone, no words, no name, only a deep engraving shaped like the foundation beams he had once built. It was said that, as they placed the final stone, the wind shifted softly, circling the cabin once before descending toward the valley, as though carrying his spirit through the places he had once walked. Years passed, and the cabin remained. The wood darkened, but never rotted. The stones settled deeper into the earth, and the roof held firm against every storm. Travelers who came across it often said that they could feel something. They stepped inside, a stillness so profound that it seemed to pause their very heart. Some swore that on quiet nights you could hear faint footsteps moving across the wooden creak of a chair of fire. Others said the mountain itself whispered through the cracks in the walls, repeating the same lesson that man had lived. What belongs endures. The settlers below continued to tell. His parents told their children about the builder who had been mocked for digging too deep, and how his foundation was the only one that stood when the storms came. They spoke of his kindness, of the way he had opened his home to those who once doubted, of the calmness that never left it. But more than that, they spoke of his silence, not as absence, but as a presence that remained. In a world that had grown louder with every passing year, his story became a reminder that peace is not found in escape, but in belonging. Generations later, when most had forgotten his name, the cabin still stood. Moss grew thick upon the stones, trees encroached around it, and yet travelers far away, guided by old map and oldest, would climb to the ridge to see the miracle cabin that refused. And though they found only weathered wood and stone, something about the place speak in hushed tones. They felt as if they were being watched, not in fear, but in quiet companionship. Those who stayed long enough sometimes said They dreamed of an old man walking among the trees, his figure blending with the shadows, his voice carried in the wind, whisper. They began to call that ridge the Foundation Peak, and soon it became a place of pilgrimage for those who had grown weary of noise and speed. People came not to build, but to listen. Some stayed for hours, others for days, sitting in the grass, feeling the weight of silence settle upon them. Many left changed. They returned to their lives, speaking less, moving slower, hearing more. The mountain, once the home of one solitary man, had become the teacher of all who came to it. His silence had become the mountain's voice. If you stand there today, on a still morning when the mist clings low to the ground, you can still see the shape of the old cabin. The roof may sag, the wood may creak, but it stands. Beneath it lies the same deep foundation that was once called foolish, the same roots that refused to yield to time or storm. If you close your eyes, you might feel the vibration of the mountain beneath you, the slow, steady pulse. And if you listen long enough, you might hear the echo of his word. What belongs endures. The story of the man and the mountain is not about solitude or survival. It is about returning to what is essential, about understanding that peace is not found by running away from the world, standing so deeply within it, nothing can move you. He did not conquer the mountain. He became it, and through him it learned to speak once more to those who had forgotten how to listen. If you are hearing this now, wherever you are, in a crowded city, in a quiet room, on your own path between noise and silence, remember that the foundation you build within yourself is the only one that truly matters. Dig deep, stay patient, and when the storms come, do not be afraid to stand still. Everything that is shallow will fall, but what is rooted in truth will remain. And if this story touched you, if somewhere inside you felt the quiet presence of that mountain, share it with those who have forgotten how still. Let it remind them that silence is not loneliness and that belonging is stronger than fear. Leave a trace of your own story here. Tell me from where you listen, how the wind sounds where you are, and whether you too have heard the mountain calling. And if you wish for more stories like this, stay close, because though this tale ends, its silence continues, and it is waiting for those who still remember how to listen.